right, good evening and welcome to the second seminar in our Labor Solidarity Project seminar this quarter. Tonight's talk is titled The Crisis at Boeing, and we have a fantastic lineup for you. Very excited for tonight's speakers, and maybe perhaps selfishly, I'm excited and prepared to learn something about a topic that I don't know all that much about in terms of labor studies. When I think of organizing in airlines, I tend to think of the PATCO strike of '81 and Reagan's betrayal of that union. And that is a model for sort of anti-union policy that continues even to this day. But I also think in terms of local labor organizing, the flight attendants' chaos strikes that actually originated here at SeaTac Airport and how successful those were. But I will say I do have sort of a blind spot for the aerospace industry. And I think in particular here in Tacoma, where Boeing does cast a very long shadow. I like to use the excuse that I am somewhat new to the area. I've only been here 5 years, but I have, in those 5 years, I have sort of developed a sense for just how essential Boeing is to this, to Seattle, Tacoma, and to the larger Washington state economy, as obviously an economic driver, but also a hub for innovation. I think, if you can't really understand what Seattle is right now without understanding Amazon, I don't think you can really understand Amazon or really even the region without understanding the history of Boeing. And to that extent, Boeing has, it's more than just the economy and the technological innovations, but there are cultural implications surrounding this company. And it really is, it has served over the generations as kind of the pride of this region. I only recently discovered that the Supersonics were named after the fact that Boeing was very close. Embarrassing, but I did recently meet someone who's lived here their entire life that didn't know that, so I don't feel too bad. But so I think due to the outsized role that Boeing plays within the region, any kind of change within the corporation necessarily reverberates out. These aren't changes that just affect people within the organization, but they affect sort of the larger community. And I think in the same way that, when we think of the ways that the auto industry, transformations within the auto industry affected a city like Detroit, or any of the Rust Belt cities as those manufacturing centers were offshored, how that sort of reverberated out socially. And I think the talk we're going to listen to tonight, we're going to have an opportunity to see how corporate policy has real social impacts. And I think, because of this crisis at Boeing, this turbulence at Boeing, it becomes something much larger with far greater reaching implications that I think speak to not only local trends within our labor market within the state of Washington, but regional and even global economic transformations. So we are extremely fortunate tonight. We have a trio of speakers who are not only experts in Boeing's corporate history, but also on the consequences that this history has had on not only its employees, but more broadly, the region itself.
I wanted to kick things off just by introducing our speakers today, and I will introduce them in order of appearance, and then I'll just give you a sense of the protocol that we kind of made up immediately before this presentation. So first off, we have Sarah Moore, who is a professor and the chair of the Department of Psychology at the University of Puget Sound. Since joining the faculty in 1993, her research is focused on the effects of work-related stressors such as layoffs, reengineering, and various job characteristics on employee health, work attitudes, and work performance. Her current research focuses on the changing social contract and the ways in which employees engage with their social work and organizations. And since 1996, Professor Moore and Leon Grunberg, who is our next speaker up here, have collaborated on this long-term project, the study of Boeing Commercial, which has twice received funding from the National Institute of Health and is designed to investigate the health and the well-being effects of organizational change. And just a bit more on Professor Grunberg. Professor Grunberg is a professor emeritus at the University of Puget Sound. His career spanned nearly 50 years, with research touching on worker ownership, workplace alienation, and employee instability due to downsizing and restructuring. He's published 4 books, the most recent being Emerging from Turbulence, Boeing and the Stories of the American Workplace Today, which he wrote with Professor Moore. And finally, Stan Sorscher is a former labor representative for the Society of Professional Engineering Employees in Aerospace, a labor union representing aerospace engineers, scientists, and technical workers. He's a board member of the Washington Fair Trade Coalition. He's active in trade, economic development, and other public policy issues. And according to the Stand, I read something you recently posted. It said that you are a retired activist. That's got to be a mistake, right? Is that something you ever really retire from?
No, I read the adjective the other way, that I've retired and I'm an activist.
Excellent.
And remain an activist.
Okay, well, good evening, and I'm glad to be here and to get a chance to talk about our research. Let me start with the second slide here, since Alex has already discussed how we're organizing the talk. So what I'm going to do initially is just give you the sort of quick big picture view of what happened, what some of the findings of our research are. And there's sort of three key themes that come out of the Boeing story. The first is how an iconic company changed and squandered its reputation for safety and quality. And it's a kind of sad and cautionary tale about what not to do, as you'll see. Secondly, I think another important theme is that change, there's been a lot of change at Boeing, and some of it was beneficial. For example, having more women and minorities in positions of power, having a more participatory kind of authority structure. But what really changed Boeing was a Boeing shift to prioritizing shareholder value. And we argue that it was wrong-headed and damaging, as you'll see. And the new ethos and mindset and practices led to some consequences like a demoralized workforce, diminished worker health, weaker unions, and contributed, we think, tentatively, to the 737 MAX problems and the loss of 386 lives. And ironically, this single-minded focus on shareholder value actually ended up not only hurting the reputation of Boeing, and what made it successful, but actually led to billions in losses because of bad decisions that were made on the 787 and the 737 MAX. Next slide, please. Sarah, next slide, please.
Yeah, it's not advancing for some reason.
Oh, okay.
There we go.
So just very briefly, why did Boeing change? And I would sort of put it this way: deregulation and Airbus really put pressure on Boeing to become more cost conscious. And globalization enabled it to increase outsourcing, and the growing importance of Wall Street simultaneously pushed it to increase its profit margins and return on investment. Changes like these were happening at many other companies across the United States. However, at Boeing, the thing that made a big difference was the merger with McDonnell Douglas. That was the key event that symbolized many of these changes for the workforce. The move of headquarters to Chicago, and then the second assembly line of the 787 to South Carolina really brought home to the employees that that Boeing was no longer tied to its historical roots in the Puget Sound region or to its workforce. And what they were really saying is that we can design and produce anywhere. Next slide. So here's a quick overview of the study. As you can see, the dark blue was the first study that was funded by the NIH, and it's longitudinal. It has a lot of people that answered questions on surveys, and we also did a lot of interviews and focus groups. And we followed some of the people under the attrition, some of the people who left Boeing. And then we came back and did another study in 2011 to 2014. And that was with a cooperation of both unions at Boeing, the machinists and the SPIA. And we kind of really wanted to bring in a generational issue that we wanted to look at. So I think what's unique about our study is that that really over 20 years, we've kind of studied the same company going through its changes. So you get a very special kind of perspective. Next slide. So I've chosen these two quotes because I think they capture some of the key changes that occurred at Boeing. The first one is by a guy called Harry Stonecipher, who came in from McDonnell Douglas with the merger in 1997. And he became the most dominant figure in the early years after the merger, and he became the CEO. And later on, when he was reflecting on what he'd done, this is what he said, that he changed they deliberately changed the culture of Boeing, so it's run like a business rather than a great engineering firm. So really what he's saying there is that he wanted to sort of, in a sense, diminish the status of the engineers and raise the status of the money guys, the bean counters, if you like. And that really led to quite a lot of changes. One of them was that the SPIA union went on strike in 2000, the union representing engineers and techs, for 40 days, which is quite unusual for professional employees to go on strike. Partly, the strike was about wanting respect and being taken and having their worth considered important. Workers, the quote I had from the employee there was very common attitude that came out after the McDonnell Douglas merger. And in a sense, they got no loyalty to me, why should I have any to them? And I think the important point here was that there was a change in the social contract that a lot of people have written about that existed between workers and employers after the Second World War, especially in large companies, where companies sort of tried to have decent pay and benefits and give workers job security. In return, they were supposed to get loyalty and commitment. And that started to break down in the 80s and 90s. And Boeing was one company that did that as well. I think an important point here that I want to make is that a lot of Boeing workers weren't against change, but what they did not like at all was the excessive focus on the bottom line, the excessive outsourcing that Boeing did, and the devaluing of in-house tribal knowledge by the bean counters that came from McDonnell Douglas. And as one employee said, the spirit had gone out of the place. So now I'm going to turn it to Sarah.
So as Leon said, we did do a longitudinal study that began in 1997. And the focus of that was to try and understand what kinds of impacts these changes had on employees' health and well-being and the relationship they had to the company, to the work that they did, and so forth. We were really interested in understanding sort of the broad impacts of these kinds of organizational changes. And one of the things that was somewhat surprising was that when we began the study, we had been focusing on the kinds of tech changes that were planned. And what we ended up getting was the opportunity to study many other changes that were unplanned or we couldn't have seen. The merger with McDonnell Douglas was not on the horizon when we began studying the company. And as Leon mentioned, that was probably the singular event that had the most profound impact in shaping the company's direction and the worker attitudes towards the company and the relationship they had to their work. And the other major event that occurred while we were studying the company was 9/11, which had just a profound impact on the airline industry. And so what I have here are a couple of slides that are just kind of exemplars of the types of quantitative changes that we documented during that time period. And this first one shows how workers' perceptions of their job being at risk just spread during the time that we studied Boeing. You can see in the blue kind of aqua colored bars, 1997, and then 2000, 2003, and 2006, which were the 4 different time periods of the survey. And here I think it's pretty self-explanatory, namely that the perception of one's job being at risk just really skyrocketed. Got perhaps a smidge better at the end of our study, but is nowhere comparable to the sort of beginning levels that we found in 1997. Moreover, you can see that it really spread to the different pay grades, that it was something that maybe hourly workers had experienced in the past. You know, when we began studying the company, we were told that, you know, downsizing and rehiring, those kinds of cycles were in fact kind of common, but workers had been sort of used to that and anticipated being rehired pretty routinely. But this period was fundamentally different because the philosophy of running the company was fundamentally different. So that was one of the changes that we found. Here's another one. Again, this was expressed to us literally hundreds of different ways. And so here are just the responses to 2 questions that had to deal with the concept of trust in management. And what you can see here are the percentage of people who disagree or strongly disagree with the statements. For example, I have complete trust in top management, with it kind of hitting an all-time high, as in a bad high, in 2000, with about 80% of the respondents saying that they disagree or strongly disagree with that statement. And the same thing is true with the other example, top management is trustworthy. And we found that time and again, not only in our survey data, but also in the kinds of comments that people made to us. The pattern that you see here is also one that we found routinely, where the middle years of our study were the ones that kind of suffered the most. I think those are the ones that are really showing the effect of the merger with McDonnell Douglas, as well as the after effects of 9/11 and the problems associated with the 787. So one of the things that we began to examine was what kind of impact did this have on people's health and well-being? And we had a number of questions that tried to get at this. Here was a number of responses to questions related to where people are kind of investing themselves. One of the things, and I think the quote that Leon described earlier kind of began to hint at this, but what we found was that, you know, early at the beginning of our study and kind of historically, heritage Boeing workers rather routinely reported being very, very invested in the company and in their work. You might even say to a fault, perhaps sometimes, where people just were completely absorbed in their jobs, very, very dedicated. They described the company as their family, and were really willing to kind of go to fairly extreme lengths to promote and support the work of Boeing. And when they found that the company was kind of maybe engaging with them or not investing in them as much as they had in the past, because again of that shift to such a excuse me, extreme shareholder mentality, they started to say, okay, fine, we're going to go invest in other places. And so what you see here, the percentage of people who responded yes to the question, in the last 2 years, have you, for example, spent more time with your family, spent more time with friends, and so forth. And across the board, what we find is that people started to kind of invest in the company and either invest or reinvest in things that were outside of work, things like their leisure time and their hobbies and family activities and friends and so forth. We also found changes to people's mental and physical health. And this graph shows the data that we got when we compared workers who stayed at the company, those people who were part of our long-term study, and in the company, with people who had been employed by Boeing in 1997 at our time one data collection, but then who left the company between 1997 and 2000. So they stayed in our sample, but they were just no longer employed with the company. And I have to say, many of these people, in fact, the vast majority of these people left the company because they were downsized out of a job. Boeing had a sort of a massive downsizing between 1997 and 2000. And typically, losing your job is not a good thing. Typically, losing your job is very hard. So these data were actually very surprising to us, because what we found was that when we measured their depression scores, or measured their depression, we found that their scores were actually better if they left the company. That is, the kind of reddish colored bars show a decrease in depression. And this was the case when they left the company, even if they left the company because they were downsized out of a job. I think what we took away from this is not that losing your job is a good thing, but rather that staying at the company during this time of profound change not only in the ways in which the planes were being produced, but in the relationships that the workers were experiencing between themselves and the company. It was extremely stressful. They felt very betrayed. It was just extremely difficult. So staying at the company, Leon and I, when we wrote the first book, we kind of use the analogy, it's kind of like staying in a bad marriage. Staying in a bad marriage is very, very stressful. And while getting divorced is hard, sometimes it may in fact be easier than being with the person with whom you are having a lot of discord. And this is kind of the same type of dynamic here. And then the same kind of thing here with blood pressure. Again, it's the same kind of comparison, looking at the people who stayed versus people who left the company. And you can see that, again, these data are longitudinal. So these are following the same people over time. And people who stayed at the company, their blood pressure continued to increase. The people who left the company, you can see they reported a decrease in heightened blood pressure. And while they went up from 2000 to 2003, that could be associated with aging, for example, where blood pressure tends to increase over time, but still enjoyed better blood pressure than the folks who were at the company. And I should make a note that when we analyzed these data, I made sure that I controlled for all kinds of extraneous or explanations. These two groups were matched on gender and pre-existing health as well as age. We have some quotes too, if you, we collected both qualitative and quantitative data because I think they each have strengths in helping us to understand what it was like to live through this time. And the quotes here are ones that are fairly extreme, but I think help to illustrate just how profoundly the workers felt these kinds of changes. You can see here the first person saying that she feels very bitter, tired all the time, not the same person as she was 20 years ago, still thinks she can make a difference, still trying to make a difference, silly me. And you can kind of hear the cynicism in that quote. And then the next two men report some pretty significant health problems. The second quote, they're talking about being hospitalized twice in the last year. And the third person saying that he found these events, speaking of the Boeing events, found these events to be so disturbing that I suffered 2 heart attacks, chronic heart failure, and internal bleeding. And then he goes on to link the incompetency of Boeing management to these problems and says, that nearly cost me my life, and ironically has done so because I care. So while these are very extreme quotes, I think that they really do kind of reflect what was told to us in all of the data that we collected. And to be fair, there were some people who, you know, came out of it maybe a little bit better off. They found some ways to be energized by change and so forth, but that was the slim minority of people. So to sum it up, I've just kind of got a few bullets here of the key findings. You know, from the workers' point of view, this shift in company values, where they started to really do all sorts of things that emphasized that the finances were driving pretty much all considerations. These were the things that really were difficult for them. And they told us that they felt that the company prioritized that over, you know, their worker well-being, the value that they brought to the company with the years of knowledge that they had in engineering and in production. They didn't value that tribal knowledge that was part of that. The company no longer valued innovation in the same way, and perhaps maybe even quality a little bit. We started to hear that towards the end of the study. It was associated with a lot of mistrust towards top management, extreme feelings of loss of that family that had been the Boeing family. They lamented the fact that they kind of couldn't be as committed and loyal anymore, started to become a little bit more instrumental in that relationship. And then this in turn spilled over into job insecurity, all kinds of sort of job affect changes, health and well-being changes. And yet through it all, I think the workers were still very much trying to kind of find meaning and to find some good in all of this. And they would say, you know, they would tell us all these negatives, but then they would say, you know, despite all this, it's still a pretty good place to be in terms of pay and benefits. It's still got a great history. I'm still very proud of the planes that we make. And then there were some changes in the unions that Leon is going to be speaking about later that show up a little bit more in the data that we collected that I'll speak about next year. So after we finished the 2006 data, and we did write a book to summarize all of the things that I just talked about and much more, Leon and I went back to the company in 2011 because we wanted to try to understand exactly how this sort of permanently changed identity in the company was experienced in now what was kind of the new normal. You know, if you think about existing employees who lived through all of this and they're still with the company, you know, how do they finally reconcile the fact that the company was changed? How do they come to terms with that? We were interested in understanding, you know, like how they saw that business strategy now that it had been in place for a while. How did they find engagement and meaning in their work? And we were also interested in understanding how newly hired people who hadn't had that Boeing kind of heritage experience, how did people say hired in 2007 or 2008 find meaning? How did they understand the company culture? How did they find meaning in their work and so forth? And so we did right around 100 individual interviews, and we did a large survey. And we did collect all these data through the union. We went to the IMN to SPIA, who were very, very helpful in sort of giving us access to their membership so that we could do this kind of work. And we also examined changes in union attitudes and all of this as well. So we just have a few things about the 2013 sample. It was an online survey, and we drew from both the IAM and from SPIA. And some of the other percentages that you see there, the other demographic characteristics, matched, in fact, the characteristics of their broader membership. So while it's always true that with a volunteer sample, you're getting a select group of people, and you're never quite sure how they map onto sort of the entire population from which you're sampling, we can say that these mean ages and mean years at Boeing and so forth were fairly representative of the broader membership at the time. So interestingly, when we looked at sort of some of the remarks from people who were newly hired, and newly hired was within the last 5 years, and further, when we looked at people who were newly hired and younger, because there was some interest in seeing if there were some generational differences with these trends as well, we did find some, I would say, acceptance of this new order. These two quotes, I think, illustrate that, you know, the new hires who are sort of the younger millennial generation, the Gen Y generation, kind of was not as turned off by some of that extreme shareholder profit mentality that we had encountered with the original data, or the original sample. For example, this first individual says, you know, if they didn't value the shareholders, they wouldn't have the money to pay for half the stuff they want to do. I understand that. I don't think that's a bad thing. No one wants to work for a company that doesn't want to make money. That's kind of what has to happen. And, you know, someone else who talks about their job security, they think, yeah, it's pretty secure compared to the total number. And then goes on to say, you know, you kind of need to cull the herd every once in a while. Perhaps expressing the point of view that some downsizing and so forth, not so bad. Why do we actually need job security? You know, it was kind of the tenor of that remark. And then some of the survey data kind of illustrate a similarly maybe positive spin on what we were finding at that time. Here are the percentage of people who either agree or strongly agree with some of these positive sort of sentiments. Proud to work for Boeing. You can see that it ranges from about, say, 67% to just shy of 80%. That's very high. People saying that they only miss work when necessary, showing up a little early to get things ready. Both those statements perhaps communicate a certain level of engagement or connection. And while there's a slightly better attitude with the new hires, that is true, those green bars are higher than the blue bars. Overall, there are some pretty positive findings. However, it was not uniformly rosy by any stretch of the imagination. And some of these qualitative remarks, I think, illustrate, again, these are from recently hired people who are younger, that they were not necessarily in love with the new corporate strategy. One person saying, well, the stingy parts surprised me quite a bit. And she goes on to say, you know, they say they value innovation, but then they value stinginess, meaning that they are very much focused on controlling cost. Second person, same kind of thing. Seems like the management is all about stock prices and their investors. And then a third person who says, you know, I'm looking for a new job. And goes on to say that they don't feel as though one person can have much impact. A lot of focus on profits, not interested in employee talent. So even newer workers who are not comparing the Boeing of today with the Boeing of yesteryear are reacting negatively to some of this changed ethos. And then again, some of the quantitative data bear this out too. What I have on the y-axis, or the percentages that you're looking at here, are the percentages of people who disagree or strongly disagree with this statement. So with that first set of bars that look at the question, the most important things involve my work, you can see we have a lot of people who are saying, no, that's not true. Again, showing that maybe they're not putting all of their eggs in the Boeing basket, so to speak, that they're actually, they've got other things in life they care about. They are not as completely enthralled with, or, you know, giving their life over to the company. And the other two remarks about how they felt about Boeing, the company. That first, the middle bar says, Boeing energizes employees around its vision and goals. And they're saying, no, not so much. Or Boeing encourages innovation and creativity. Again, there's a fairly high percentage of people who are disagreeing with those statements. When we look at the way in which heritage Boeing employees are kind of functioning in this new environment, and by heritage, I mean people who lived through the merger, people who knew Boeing before all of that had happened. What we found is that, people were still able to engage with their work. I think one of the things that impressed us a great deal was that despite all this change and despite the fact that so many long-term employees were really very disillusioned by what had happened, they were nonetheless still very dedicated to the idea of doing a good job. There's a lot of pride in their own workmanship, or their own kind of professionalism. And so we were wondering, how is it that one reconciles staying at a company that has produced so much discord or so much upsetness in their workforce? Well, how are these people sort of finding some peace with that and still able to go in there and do a job day after day? And what we found was that people had different strategies for doing this. And what I've illustrated here on this slide and the next are the different ways in which we found that. One group of workers did something that we ended up titling shift to profession, meaning that rather than seeing themselves as sort of a Boeing identity employee, they now had more of identities with their profession or with other kinds of concepts. So this first person says here, I used to be a Boeing engineer. Now I'm an engineer that works at Boeing. And I think that's just really profound, that identity shift that this man is expressing. And he goes on to say that's a very difficult paradigm shift. But now he's, he's finding importance in making sure that he is serving the flying public. Someone else, here what I've got labeled the work itself, I think illustrates another way in which Boeing workers were able to sort of reconcile what had happened. And this is by kind of involving themselves in the actual work and the problem solving associated with it. He goes on to describe something there that is kind of just really inherently very interesting, and kind of those connections with other people and problem solving was the way he connected. And then unfortunately, we have people who just become very instrumental. And this person, goes on to say, we're not a group anymore. It went from headquartered in Seattle to headquartered in Chicago. Afterward, the management looked at you more as you're a number. I became a number. And that's when I started just getting a paycheck. So you can see that, he's putting in 8 hours of work for 8 hours of pay. It ends by saying, when we were more of a family, I would help my family. Now it's not a family, so I don't help. So I'm just basically doing what I'm required to do. So I'm turning it back over to Leon here now.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. I'm a bit worried about time, so I'm just going to be very brief about what I'm going to say about the unions, and open to questions in Q&A. So I think I'll show you a little bit of data in a minute, but just to put it into context, as happened nationally, strong unions at Boeing got weaker over time due to both political and economic national developments, and to really what Boeing was doing to weaken the unions by essentially threatening and actually doing moving work outside of the Puget Sound region. So that threat became very powerful, gave it a lot of leverage in negotiations with the unions on when contracts came up. So what you get is a diminishment of the power of a strong union, especially the machinists were very strong at Boeing, historically had won many benefits and good pay. You're getting a weakening of the unions. And then in addition, more recently, the last two contracts have been for much longer periods. Instead of 3 or 4 years, they became 6 and 8 years, which in a sense took away the strike, the possibility of a strike, and in a sense made the unions much more quiet in terms of negotiations. Next slide, please. So here's a little bit of data. So one of the questions we asked was, do you think the unions are effective at doing the various things on the bottom there, improving salary and benefits, improving working conditions? And we asked them that question about what do they think is happening now at the time of the survey in 2013, and what do you think about the future? And what's interesting, if you look at the blue bars, is that there's very high belief in the efficacy, the effectiveness of the unions at what we call the bread and butter issues, pay, benefits, working conditions, less so on things like limiting outsourcing or improving workplace productivity. And secondly, and perhaps more worrying, I think, especially as you think about the role of the union moving forward, the brown bars are what they think is going to happen in the future. Now, just to point out, this is people who think the union is, the question was how very successful, will they be very successful in doing the various things on the x-axis there. And what you see is across the board, a very pessimistic view of what unions can deliver in the future. Next slide. So on this slide, we kind of changed the question. We went to the percent who had a negative view on the effectiveness of the union, but this time we added the same topics, but we added generation to compare different generations. The Gen Y generation is the blue bar, Gen X is the red, and green is the baby boomers. And as you can see, I think the sort of takeaway point, there's lots of things going on, but pretty much across the board, the younger generations have a more negative view of the role of the union. And so the question is why? Why would younger generations have a less negative view? And so we had on the survey, we had something called an individualism scale, which was measuring things like questions like, I rely on myself most of the time. I rarely rely on other people. And what we found, of course, is that the younger cohorts had a much higher individualism score on the scale. And we found that the higher individualism tended to be associated with more or less favorable views towards the union. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go through all the other findings. There were, the first three are about comparing the two of them are about comparing Speer and the machinists. But I thought what was interesting, most people had a fairly positive view of the union. But I thought what was interesting is the last two, which is that workers who had parents in the union, who had parents who had been in the union, had more positive views about the union, both now and in the future, and similarly with minorities and women. And I think those are sort of interesting for unions to sort of chew on and to think about how to reach out to younger workers in particular, and people to get them to learn more about the unions. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So the majority believe unions are needed for pay and benefits and job security. I want to talk a little bit about the division. There was a fairly even division between those who thought the unions were too conciliatory, they weren't militant enough when they were in negotiations with the management, and there were others who thought that the unions were too militant, too confrontational, and they should be more cooperative. And then I think the other point I wanted to make is at the end there, a lot of workers suggested, union members suggested, that the union should be much more visible and have a bigger role on the shop floor. Things like participating in training of new employees, educating them about the importance of the union and what the union could deliver for them. Next slide. So here's a few quotes. I'm not going to read them out. I'll let you scan them about why, where workers said that they really needed unions and they had an important role to play. You can see there the fear of the last quote about how rooted Boeing is in the Puget Sound area. That was quite a concern even back a few years ago. Okay, next slide, please. And here's some criticisms about unions should be a little better partners. And then often from machinists, we had who weren't very happy with the seniority, on the second quote, with the seniority provisions, because they thought it protected sometimes people who weren't pulling their weight and working as hard as other people. Okay, next slide, please. So there were some suggestions. By the way, a lot of these quotes come from, we sent the survey to 3,600 people. 900 of them took the time to write in-depth comments about their views on Boeing and the role of the unions. And this is where some of these representative comments come from. And as you can read, they have some very specific suggestions about how to make the union more relevant and more involved in the daily life of employees. I think I particularly like the last quote there. Okay, the next slide. Okay, and I think again, I'd like to end on an optimistic note, but at the moment, you know, political developments could have, obviously on the national level and the local level in Olympia, could change things. I know Boeing, the unions are pressing Boeing about some of the aid it got from the state, trying to tie it to specific employment levels and so on. So there are political reasons why unions are on the defensive. And at Boeing, we've already discussed some of the things that have weakened the unions. I think what the unions can do is, in some sense, intensify their efforts to shore up their internal support, especially among younger workers, because often they don't have very much knowledge about what unions can do. And I think you have to get them when they're really young and to teach them about union history. The great unknown is, of course, how will the current crisis, which has hit Boeing very hard and is threatening the jobs of many employees at Boeing, how the current crisis will reshape union management relationships. Okay, next slide. So this is, I just wanted to throw this in because I know this is of interest to everyone. So the question is, does all the cultural changes that we've discussed and some of the consequences, can it contribute, did it contribute to those 737 MAX crashes? And we sort of give a tentative yes. For time's sake, I just want to say it was mainly with hindsight that I realized, for example, that the genesis of the MAX tragedies was rooted in the post-merger culture, that safety and quality cannot be insulated from the wider values and goals in the culture. So gradually, but invariably, these goals and values compromise safety and the duty to take the time and care, the repeated testing, the inspections, the backup systems, the redundancies. And in the worst case, if you don't do those things, it can be catastrophic. And there are many examples in both the books that we've written on Boeing. When you go back with hindsight and you look through the material, there are lots of signs, small signs, that these things were beginning to sort of fray that safety culture that was so important to Boeing's reputation as a great company, a great engineering company producing safe airplanes, and that the workers took pride in, was beginning to sort of, as I say, fray. There are quotes, I just took some out, about there were pressures on managers, engineers, and production workers to reduce costs, to work faster and harder, of time panic, of being accused of not being a team player if they raise problems with management. And the last slide, and then is a quote. The next slide is a quote which I took from the second book that we wrote, and I'll let you read it. And I think it's a telling example from one engineer who'd been there 40 years at Boeing, about his concerns of how the new culture started to undermine the care and the due diligence that Boeing used to have when developing new models. And he's talking about the 787 here. And although they actually did ground the 787 planes because of battery fires, you may remember that, thankfully there were no fatalities and the plane is flying safely. Anyway, now I'm going to turn it over to Stan, who's going to go into some detail of the business culture.
Thanks. This is fascinating. I have to say, I've read Professor Grunberg's and Professor Moore's books, and it all just comes back very powerfully. One thing I want to emphasize is that anything happening at Boeing is in the context of things happening nationally. And since Ronald Reagan and the late 70s, there's been a shift in American manufacturing from performance and customers in favor of shareholders. And aerospace is sort of like the last industry to get swept up in this. But I think it was clear to me, in retrospect actually, you could see signs of that in 1995 with the big layoffs there, and we were told those jobs are not coming back ever. So it wasn't going to be cyclical anymore. There's a change that they were planning. In 96, we were told our products were commodity-like, which was a shock to everybody who worked at Boeing. We didn't think our products were commodity-like. We thought they're very performance-driven. And then in 97, everybody, consciously or unconsciously, could feel the effects of cost-cutting. And this is prior to the merger in August of 1997. And people say that McDonnell Douglas bought Boeing with Boeing's money. Boeing wanted to be bought. They were ready to do this. This was not a takeover or a seizure. The Boeing executives and the Boeing board knew exactly where they were going, and it was McDonnell Douglas culture was exactly what they were going after. That's my personal feeling. Another thing that Professor Grunberg and Professor Moore said that really resonated with me is that Boeing employees are really dedicated to the products, whether it's pride in workmanship or professionalism, however you say it. They would love to be dedicated to the company, but if the sense of identification or engagement is undermined, we're all still dedicated to the products. I have no formal training in culture. I know nothing about culture that I didn't learn off the street, where a lot of good education comes from. I'm fascinated by it now. To me, culture, I think of culture in this context as behavior. So if you look at the workplace, here, let's see if I can do this. And this is in your reading, so everybody's responsible for knowing this already. I identified 3 business cultures that I perceived at Boeing when I was an employee there. The first one was focused around performance. And we think of the 747. Are we okay? Mm-hmm. So bigger, faster, higher. We would outcompete our competitors by having more formidable products. And then we would make a lot of money and we would sell a lot of airplanes and we would be successful as a company by being successful with our products. So first it was customers, then products, and then money. The second culture, period, era of culture was after this shift, after the merger in the, I'm sorry, it was before the merger in the mid-90s. The Japanese manufacturing was seen as a formidable threat, and they managed to perform a miracle. In production, there's this sense of a triangle that you can have low cost, you can have fast delivery, or you can have quality or performance, but you can't have all three. So you can pick two. If you want quality at a low cost, it's going to take a lot of time. If you want low cost delivered fast, you're going to have to sacrifice quality. And if you want quality and immediately, it's going to cost you a lot of money. That was the core knowledge of American manufacturing. The Japanese manufacturing seemed to be able to do all three. And we're very quickly swept through photocopiers and cameras and lots of other industries. And American manufacturing saw this as something that we needed to understand. So Boeing actually did a fabulous job of adapting some of these Japanese concepts about getting, working on productivity and systems and getting your learning curve down as fast as possible. So you would improve productivity. Each unit you made a little faster and a little better. And all of that came from engagement of employees, which was just a super feeling for all the employers, all the employees. So in the performance-driven culture, it was the top engineering managers who set the goals, determined the priorities, asked the important questions, made the important decisions, and they were based on technical competence, which was actually also a great feeling. In the second culture, it was really about teams in the workplace and treating everybody with respect and including everybody and listening to everybody. And that developed into a high trust environment, and change was actually very easy. And all the changes came out as value in the product for the customers. The third culture, as I say, I started to see glimmers of it in 1995, and it's pretty clear in 1996 and then 1997, and then it was bombs away after that. The products were seen as commodities, and there wasn't a lot of value that could be created by the employees. Now value could be extracted from the employees and extracted from the suppliers and extracted from the state legislatures. So now there was this sort of legacy of value that was off the books that the executives and the board and the shareholders could commoditize and financialize and extract. And so instead of being team-oriented and focused on the products, it was much easier to extract value from different stakeholders if you made them feel weak and precarious and aware of rivals. So that that's really, I think, the logic behind opening another production line in South Carolina, is to make sure that nobody felt strong enough to resist a decision that came from managers that was bad for them, but bad for the stakeholder, but good for the shareholders. So a lot of that trust and engagement just wasn't part of that business model. Let's talk a little bit about labor relations. In any contract, the first thing in the contract is who the parties are. And the second thing is rights of management. Management gets to set the business model. That's their right. And I sometimes think of unions as being an amplifier for whatever culture management sets. If management sets an adversarial culture, unions will amplify that. If management sets a collaborative culture, unions can amplify that. So in this first culture at Boeing that I experienced, the performance-driven one was really about technical competence And the relationship between, our union and managers was very collegial. We identified with managers, and the managers actually identified with us. And when we went on strike in 2000, the managers thought of us as betraying that trust, which I thought was kind of weird. Like, didn't you guys ever go to civics class, like in 10th grade? This is what we get to do. But they also saw that trust thing from their side of that. In the working together model, this was really amazing for me. This middle culture of high engagement. The unions were openly characterized as being legitimate stakeholders, and we were included in safety, we were included in planning, and we were included in transition teams. And so were suppliers, and so was the FAA, and so whoever had a voice that could make a difference and improve the outcomes were thought of as legitimate stakeholders, and they were included. And that's the way our labor relations went. We had actually one of the best contract experiences ever in 1995 in this middle culture. And then we really got shot to pieces after the merger, and we went on strike in 2000. So there you go. In the cost-cutting model, unions were seen as a stakeholder that could say no. And this was not allowed. Nobody says no in this cost-cutting model, because this is going to be, most of the decisions are going to be bad for the stakeholders. They're going to lose, well-being. And the last thing that the major, the super stakeholder ever wants to see is anybody saying no. And a union going on strike, that is the ultimate no. And they cannot abide this. So let me say one more thing about problem solving. That was in some of the comments that I think Professor Moore showed. That's all we do at work, is solve problems. I mean, really, that's the way manufacturing is, and certainly the way aerospace manufacturing is. A new airplane program might have 20,000 problems that you have to solve. And the quality of that problem-solving culture determines success or failure. So in this first culture, the problem-solving behavior was all about, well, what are our problems? What are our priorities? In that first culture, it was largely expressed as technical competence. The first and second level supervisors, the chief engineers, the middle managers, and all the way to the top, the program managers, everybody was involved in making competent, engineering-based facts and data decisions that balanced shareholders' interests. It was really astonishing. I'd never seen anything like it. In the second culture, a lot of that engagement and activity and thought was pushed down to the worker level. Which gave us a lot of power. And so one of the things here I say, center of the universe, workers were at the center of the universe. In the first performance-driven model, the engineering leaders were at the center of the universe. And in the cost-cutting model, the executives and the shareholders are at the center of the universe. They're the ones who settle all disputes in their favor, basically. So the great questions that I heard and the behavioral points, have you talked to so-and-so? Make sure that you check with aerodynamics, or make sure these guys in structures know what you're doing. That coordination, that was the leadership message in the engineering focus model. In the working together model, that was automatic because all those people were in your team and they already knew what you were doing. In the cost-cutting model, we got two versions of this. In the 787 program, the mantra was just follow the plan. I don't want to hear your problems. Just follow the plan. There aren't any decisions we have to make. Just follow the plan. The second one we heard in the 737 MAX and 777X is, why are we doing this? Is this something we have to do? What if we don't do this? Which I think is what Professor Grunberg was saying about this. That one of the slides said culture of concealment. I'm not sure anybody was concealing anything. It was more like suppression. I don't want to hear your bad story. That's follow the plan. And like, why are we doing this after all? Why are we doing that test? Do we really need to do that test? And it's like casting a shadow or doubt over everything. Things that we normally would have just done or gotten scolded for not doing. Now we're getting scolded for doing it. And what if we hadn't done it? So that's a very corrosive culture. One other thing about this, I just want to say one more time, a lot of human behavior is about power. And I think the workers were generally okay in the first culture with having competent, respected engineering leaders have power. We were okay with that. We were very pleased, and I saw this super on the shop floor with machinists, those integrated teams and workers having power. Nobody had a problem with that. Everybody has a problem with the executives and shareholders having power. That trick doesn't work. You know, you could get engineers to buy into it if it actually worked, but nobody believes it's going to work. We know what it looks like to solve 20,000 problems, and we know what it looks like to be told, just follow the plan, and the first one works and the second one doesn't. So that's just, that's where a lot of that stress comes from. A lot of that stress comes from the loyalty thing, but also the sense of chaos and the loss of competence and the ability to make decisions, the paralysis that is so frustrating for people who are accustomed to problem solving. All right, so let me say one other thing. I grew up in Michigan, and I'm familiar with the UAW and Ford and General Motors. They have always been treated as legitimate stakeholders in the community. That was just a part of our culture in the Midwest. You know, I think Professor Grunberg said something a little bit about that. This new national shift to where unions don't play a legitimate role, they're not a legitimate stakeholder, is just poisonous. And again, I see that as part of the context of politics in America generally. This whole neoliberal markets are going to solve all the problems, small government, all that other stuff. If your background values are that money talks and profit is the only thing that matters, it's just going to be really tough. And you know, I think Professor Grunberg said that certainly the Great Recession and now this COVID thing has pretty much demolished that sense that markets are going to solve our problems. And I really see this as a pivotal moment in history. All right, that's what I wanted to say.
Excellent, thank you so much. I want to hand it over to the assembled audience here for questions. I do have, I've noticed nobody's actually typed any questions into the chat board, so while that happens, so go ahead, if you have questions, please do add them. We had some questions that were submitted ahead of time by students, and I've got a couple here that I would like to raise. They're all very good. I was kind of sorting through them. One that I was particularly interested in, this idea of, I guess this is for Leon and Sarah, but maybe even Stan, having seen the labor movement develop and diminish over time. We had a question, why do you think younger workers are more cynical of unions when unions have been shown to be able to leverage workers' rights, benefits, and protect against unfair termination? Knowing that working conditions and benefits at companies such as Walmart and Amazon that actively prevent unions from forming. So what is, do you have a larger sense of this, just sort of the, I don't want to start millennial bashing.
We took data like that ourselves at the union. And what we noticed was young people, you know, had everything that Professor Moore said, this sense of, you know, I'm in charge of my own destiny and all that. And the longer people stayed at Boeing, the more enthusiastic they were about unions. That piece is just what people experience. I don't think that's particular to Boeing. That, you know, when I do new hire orientation at Boeing, and you can't imagine how, well, you can, I'm sure, imagine how shocked people are to find out that they're in a union. This is like incomprehensible. I've seen polling data that young people are the most favorable toward unions of any age cohort. Until you get to like 80-year-old people, I think. But that thing that I think Professor Moore said, that we're, you know, when we're young, we think that we're in charge of our lives.
There's I remember a few quotes from the data that we got in 2013. A number of people saying, who were new hires and younger. First of all, they didn't have a sense of history. So they didn't realize that these had been things that people had to fight for and actually work hard. I mean, decades hard to get. And so they just thought, of course you get vacation. Of course there's health benefits. It's just the way it always has been in their own experience. And they really thought that if they didn't like their particular deal, well, they could just go and talk to the person in charge and work out a more favorable thing for themselves. That you just work it out, and didn't have any sense that there was a need for any kind of collective action to be heard. There was, I think, a lack of history, is how I would explain it.
Well, I've got another one that was sort of offered ahead of time and has kind of been repeated here in the chat board. Given the recent turbulence experienced by Boeing surrounding the MAX disaster and the firing of the CEO, is this an opportunity for Boeing to correct course? Do we see this as a potential for maybe a resurgent union within Boeing?
Sure, it's a potential. It's not going to happen. I've been watching David Calhoun, the new CEO, for any signal that he thinks this is a time for change. And, there's an industry observer who was on the internet. He had some video, which I can't find anymore. And he pointed out that this is actually working for the shareholders. Boeing has diverted 92% of free cash flow over the last 5 years to shareholders. They extracted $70 billion out of the substance of the company, leaving behind God knows what. I mean, maybe they think it over differently now. But what this industry observer said is that cash flow is like a drug. And you're dealing with executives and a board of directors that's like addicts. And you're asking them to go cold turkey on cash flow. And I didn't pay any attention at all to cash flow until like 5 or 10 years ago. And I remember Phil Condit, when he was CEO, started giggling about throwing off free cash. And I thought, what? I don't have an image of that at all. I don't throw cash ever, right? What is he talking about, throwing off free cash? That was his first hit, I think. And these guys, I don't think they're pharmacologically capable of giving that up and going back. They will have to be displaced.
What would you say? Another question we had submitted ahead of time. What's been the role of right to work states in the sort of the progressive breakdown of Boeing as a corporation? It occurred to me as you were talking, I was thinking about the film from the 80s, Gung Ho, that's all about sort of a automobile factory moving abroad. And it seems like we currently live in a situation where corporations don't even have to threaten to move out of the country. It's just sort of moving into a different state.
I think Leon said that the strike really is your opportunity to have power. And if chapter 1 of the anti-union handbook is contract extension, so that people don't have the experience of exercising power. They don't see themselves as having power. And then the threat of runaway shop, of moving the work to a non-union location, makes it really an act of courage to go on strike. Our strike in 2000 was not an act of courage. We were just too stupid to know any better. We had no business going into that strike, and it was a freak of nature that we did so well. But most unions do get that. While we were on strike, our international president spoke at a big rally, and he said for the last 20 years, collective bargaining is about hanging on to what you've got, right? And when I was a kid in Michigan, collective bargaining is where you improve the medical plan and improve the pension and improve the compensation. And I think part of that shift of power, was the larger neoliberal thing, but certainly at the collective bargaining level, it was the threat of moving away. And then again, that's consistent with this, Walmart cost-cutting business model. It's obvious to you who your rivals are, and you have plenty of rivals, and your employer can ditch you for a rival anytime they want to, and that's a power statement.
Nice. We had another sort of a question contained within an anecdote. We have somebody tuning in here who is currently an employee at Boeing. Who writes, when I started at Boeing, their mantra was world-class competitiveness. In my intake interview, I was asked what that means to me. I answered it means being able to successfully market your product worldwide. Is there any chance this could come back to the Boeing work culture? And that actually, that kind of ties into the next question that was posed, just whether or not Stan or Sarah or Leon, would any of you recommend working at Boeing at this point as an engineering graduate?
Oh.
Was that a no?
Well, we definitely have comments in the books by people who've been there a long time who said, I wished I could recommend it to my son or daughter to go into Boeing, but they felt less and less that way as time went on. I would say, though, that for machinists, for people who don't have a degree, a graduate degree or even just an undergraduate degree, working at Boeing is still probably one of the best places to work in terms of pay and benefits. I'm not talking about all the other stuff that happened at Boeing, some of the sort of stuff that Sarah was talking about. But just in terms of pay and benefits, it's still a way for a lot of people who don't have a college degree to have a middle class or close to a middle class lifestyle. There aren't many places like that left in the United States. But for engineers, I don't know. I don't know what Stan has, if Stan has a comment on that.
I think Sarah's data is my experience. And some of the remarks in the slides. A lot of new hires come in and you say, well, I'm going to work for 2 or 3 years and pad my resume and then go get a good job, right? I love my job at Boeing. It disappeared and I left. I think, there's sort of the background answer to that question. I would say, as a father talking to my children or my niece or nephew or my cousins or something, this is not a good time to get in line to get a job at Boeing. Boeing is facing a world of hurt, and I'm not confident about their leadership. And I've also had the experience as a father of not having my children listen to anything I've said to them and not taking any advice from me. So I get that, which is kind of, what Professor Grunberg was saying. It is, there are some really cool, great things about working at Boeing. And there's that kind of mercenary sense we got from one of the slides, even in 1980, everybody in my group was thinking about being laid off on Thursday and having to get a different job. Thursday was layoff day at Boeing.
I had another question that was submitted ahead of time, and this one is particularly timely. Thinking of Boeing and other companies like that in light of the recent bailout, these American companies that are, in a sense, too big to fail, are these companies unique in terms of how the unions need to sort of take them on, knowing that the government will inevitably intervene on their behalf in real times of economic hardship?
That's an interesting angle on it. That you mean because they're vulnerable and weak right now, that this and they're going to get bailed out. This is a good time for unions to push. Is that the point you were sort of asking about?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's that, and the fact that they have sort of a near monopoly over an essential American industry. It makes it that much more difficult for unions to really push back when you have the U.S. government or state government or federal government on the side of the corporation.
Oh, I see.
I see a little bit of that from the AFL-CIO. And lobbying, not with the employer, there's no hope there. But putting conditions like with the financial bailout, firing the CEO at General Motors, I'm sure that a lot of labor people at the national level had something to say about that. And putting the conditions on this bailout, one of the conditions was that I just saw in the paper today for the aerospace industry, that $71 billion or whatever it is that anybody who took bailout money would have to be neutral in an organizing campaign. Oh, really? Well, Boeing is not going to be neutral in an organizing campaign in South Carolina. That is not going to happen. But suddenly it's getting interesting, right? When, Professor Miller asked the question, I was like, no, not going to happen. But, oh, look, here's an example of how it could happen. And so, yeah, maybe.
Well, I think we've got time for one more question. If anybody in the audience has one.
There's one in the chat thing. It says, why would Boeing change this culture? Was it a risk they took to increase profits that backfired? They went into this out of class solidarity with the rest of American manufacturing and capital. Boeing was very active in the Business Roundtable and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. This was a thing that happened to America, and Boeing was expected to step up and do their version of it. I think it was dumb and predictably dumb and foreseeably dumb, and all the workers at Boeing who knew what it took to build an airplane knew that this wasn't going to work. And that was, I think, one of the reasons they had to move the headquarters to Chicago, is so that they wouldn't be close to employees who were saying this is not going to work, and that they would be closer to Wall Street, who said this is what you must do. And there was actually an article, one of those public interest stories in the Wall Street Journal that I thought was fascinating, where Phil Condit explained how brutally the financial people treated him when he didn't make enough money on the 777. And he wanted to please them more than he wanted to please us. And so it's complex and a lot of, psychology there, but yeah, it didn't work. One other thing, during our strike and before our strike, we talked to a lot of financial analysts to try and understand this question. And they explained it to us, very clearly. We would say, this is not going to work. And one of the financial analysts said, he was very thoughtful, very smart, very forthcoming. I learned a lot from, Professor Moore and Professor Grunberg. I also learned a lot from these financial analysts. And one financial analyst said to me, look, you're telling me you're different. Your business is different. Your customers are different. Everybody thinks they're different. Nobody is different. This business model works for everybody. It works for ladies' garments, running shoes, cell phones, hard drives, integrated circuits. It works for everybody and it'll work for you. And I thought, well, you aren't as smart as I thought you were, but I didn't say that. And I'm a little passive aggressive. So I said to him, look, let's try and build an airplane with this business model. And if you're right, then you and everybody who looks like you is going to be really happy. And if I'm right, we're all going to be very unhappy. And this was in 2002. And we did the experiment with the 787, which we started in 2004. And that was, I'm pretty sure that experiment worked out badly. But nobody changed their mind. They are still stuck on this.
And then we have one final question. Just given the shortcomings of the the continued outsourcing of the engineering wing on Boeing's business plan, do you think is that likely to change? Are they likely to sort of bring things back closer to in-house, or do we think that is just sort of the way they'll be running this business moving forward, even given the disasters?
Well, given the disasters of the 787 model, they did bring some things back for the 777X. They brought the wings back, and so, whether they're going to continue to do that, I don't know. And given what's happening right now with trade with China and stuff, which is really one of their most important markets, this is going to be an interesting question.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, I think Sarah made it back in. Is that you over there? Excellent. You're just in time for me to thank all of you again for being so generous with your time, and thank you so much for your work and your expertise. I think this was a really interesting conversation, and I just can't tell you how much I appreciate it. Thank you so much. The thank yous are coming in on the chat board.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for inviting
you.
me.
Thank you. Yeah.
Excellent. Have a great evening.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.